Dust swirled through the bustling streets of Leadville, Colorado, as the auctioneer's gavel slammed against the wooden block. It wasn't livestock on display, but a shivering, soot-stained orphan. From the crowd, a wealthy man in a tailored suit walked past with his pampered daughter. She pointed a gloved finger at the bruised child and chirped, "Can we buy that boy, Daddy?" Standing in the shadows, a rugged mountain man turned to leave until he saw the jagged scar on the boy's cheek. It was a mirror image of the woman he buried 5 years ago. The year was 1878, and the silver boom had turned Leadville from a quiet alpine valley into a chaotic, mud-soaked metropolis of greed. The air tasted of sulfur, wood smoke, and desperation. Down from the high peaks of the Mosquito Range came Judd Lawson, a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite of the mountains he called home. Clad in thick buckskins, a heavy buffalo hide coat, and sporting a thick grizzled beard that hid a jawline set like an anvil, Judd was a ghost. He only came down to the sprawling mining town twice a year to trade his pelts at Horace Tabor's general store, stock up on coffee and ammunition, and disappear back into the silent wilderness before the rot of civilization could cling to his boots. He had finished his trading, his saddlebags were heavy, and his buckskin horse, a massive beast named Duke, was restless amid the clanging of blacksmith hammers and the drunken shouts of silver miners. Judd was leading Duke down Harrison Avenue, intending to ride out before the first heavy snow of November hit the pass. But a bottleneck in the street forced him to a halt. A crowd had gathered outside the assay office, pushing and shoving to get a better look at a makeshift wooden stage. Judd pulled the brim of his slouch hat down, his icy blue eyes narrowing. Atop the wooden crate stood Reverend Ephraim Boggess, a man whose clerical collar was tightly fastened around a neck thick with gluttony. Boggess ran the local Orphanage and Temperance Society, a notorious racket that took in the children of deceased miners and prostitutes, only to auction them off as indentured servants to local farms, mills, or wealthy households under the guise of apprenticeships. It was slavery, cleanly packaged in legal paperwork. On the block stood a boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old. His clothes were ragged, oversized potato sacks held together by twine. His small feet were bare and blue from the biting Colorado wind, and his face was smeared with ash and dirt. But it was his posture that struck Judd. Most children on that block wept. This boy stood entirely still, staring a hole through the mud of the street, his small hands curled into tight, trembling fists. "Here we have a sturdy lad," Reverend Boggess bellowed, his voice carrying over the din of passing wagons. "No kin to claim him, strong enough to muck out stalls, small enough to clean your chimneys. Do I hear $20 for a 10-year indenture?" the crowd murmured. No one seemed eager to take on another mouth to feed as winter approached. Judd felt a familiar sickness in his stomach. He hated this town. He hated the people in it. He turned Duke's reins, preparing to spur the horse away from the miserable sight. Just then, a polished black carriage rolled to a halt at the edge of the crowd. Out stepped Cornelius Beaumont, a ruthless railroad tycoon who had recently come west to expand his empire. He was flanked by Pinkerton guards and dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that mocked the dusty poverty around him. Trailing behind Cornelius was his daughter Abigail, a spoiled girl of about 8, swathed in expensive European velvet and fur. Abigail stopped, her eyes catching the miserable child on the block. She tugged hard on her father's tailored sleeve. "Look at him, Daddy," Abigail piped up, her voice sharp and piercing in the cold air. She pointed a delicate lace-gloved finger directly at the shivering boy. "He looks just like a sad little stray dog. Can we buy that boy, Daddy? I could dress him up in little suits and make him carry my parasol." Cornelius Beaumont chuckled, a deep rumbling sound of pure arrogance. He patted his daughter's head. "Well, my sweet girl, I suppose the stables could use another hand, and if he amuses you, why not? Beaumont raised a silver-tipped walking stick toward the reverend. $50, Bogus. Have your clerks draw up the indenture papers and wash the filth off him. $50. Sold to Mr. Beaumont, Bogus cried out, slamming the mallet against a crate in triumph. Judd closed his eyes, exhaling a long breath that plumed white in the freezing air. It wasn't his fight, the mountains were calling. But as the boy was roughly shoved forward by one of Bogus's handlers, a gust of harsh mountain wind ripped across the street. The heavy draft blew the boy's ragged shirt wide open at the collar. Judd's breath caught in his throat. Hanging from a frayed leather cord around the boy's scrawny neck was a heavy, tarnished silver locket. It caught the weak afternoon sunlight, flashing a brilliant, unmistakable reflection. Judd froze. His heart, which had beaten with a slow, indifferent rhythm for 5 long years, suddenly hammered against his ribs like a trapped wild animal. He dropped Duke's reins. He didn't even realize he was moving until his heavy boots were tearing through the muddy street, shoving rough miners and wealthy businessmen aside with the force of a landslide. He reached the front of the crowd just as Bogus's handler grabbed the boy's arm to drag him toward the Beaumont carriage. "Take your hands off him," Judd's voice rumbled. It wasn't a shout, but the low, dangerous growl of a predator. The crowd fell completely silent. The sheer size of the mountain man, standing 6'3" and broad as a barn door, commanded immediate terror. He stepped up to the wooden platform. The boy looked up, his striking green eyes locking onto Judd's. Judd's vision blurred, the eyes, the jagged little scar near the boy's jawline. And the locket. Judd knew every scratch, every dent on that piece of silver. He had hammered it out of a Mexican silver peso himself, carving a wild columbine flower into the metal with a hunting knife. It was Josie's locket. 5 years ago, Judd Lawson was a different man. He wasn't a ghost haunting the high ridges. He was a man building a kingdom out of pine logs in the San Juan Mountains. He had a cabin, a plot of fertile land in a hidden valley, and the love of Josephine Mercer. Josie had wild raven black hair and eyes the color of summer pine needles, the exact eyes that were staring back at him right now from the face of a terrified, shivering 5-year-old boy. Judd had asked Josie to marry him by the banks of the Animas River. He didn't have money for a diamond ring, so he forged that silver locket, placing a small tin-type photograph of himself inside, telling her it was so she would never have to be alone when he was out running his trap lines. Their happiness had been a fragile, beautiful thing, shattered on a cold Tuesday in November. Judd had gone high into the peaks to track an elk. When he returned 3 days later, his world was gone. The cabin had been burned to the foundation. The tracks of heavy horses and men in hobnailed boots surrounded the ashes. He found bones in the charred remains of the cellar. The local law, Sheriff Amos Clary, had waved it off as a tragic accident or a rogue Apache raid, refusing to investigate the powerful land grabbers who had been trying to push settlers out of the valley. Judd had buried the ashes. He buried his heart with them. He had retreated into the most unforgiving corners of the Rockies, punishing himself with the cold and the solitude, surviving only because he was too stubborn to die. Now, standing on the muddy streets of Leadville, the ghosts of his past had suddenly materialized in the flesh and bone of a 5-year-old child. "Now, see here, friend," Reverend Bogus stammered, stepping back as Judd climbed onto the wooden platform. "This boy has been legally auctioned to Mr. Beaumont. The transaction is complete." Cornelius Beaumont stepped forward, his Pinkerton guards resting their hands on their holstered revolvers. "I don't know what kind of frontier savage you think you are," Beaumont sneered, adjusting his tailored lapels, "but I suggest you step away from my property before my men teach you a lesson in civility." Judd didn't even look at the millionaire. His eyes were locked on the boy. The child was trembling violently, staring up at the giant mountain man with a mixture of terror and awe. "What's your name, son?" Judd asked, his voice cracking, softening into a tone he hadn't used in half a decade. "Toby," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse from crying days ago. "Where did you get that locket, Toby?" Judd asked, ignoring the Pinkertons drawing closer. "My mama gave it to me," the boy said, clutching the silver piece tightly to his chest. "Before the bad men took her." The world seemed to stop spinning. The sounds of Leadville faded into a dull ringing in Judd's ears. Before the bad men took her? Not dead. Josie wasn't dead. Sheriff Amos Clary, a man whose tin star was bought and paid for by men like Beaumont, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He rested his hand on his Colt pacemaker. "Lawson," Clary warned, recognizing the mountain man. "You've been out in the woods too long. Step down from there. Mr. Beaumont bought the boy fair and square. You're interfering with lawful commerce." Judd turned slowly. The sheer, unadulterated violence radiating from his stance made Sheriff Clary take a half step backward. Judd reached into the deep pocket of his buffalo coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it through the air. It landed on Reverend Bogus's ledger table with a heavy metallic thud that cracked the wood. "There's $100 in raw placer gold in that pouch," Judd said, his voice carrying the dangerous calm of a looming avalanche. "The boy comes with me." "I bid 50, Beaumont snapped, his face reddening with indignation. "Sheriff, arrest this vagrant. He is impeding my daughter's wishes." Abigail Beaumont stomped her little foot in the mud. "I want him, Daddy. You promised I could have him." Judd slowly unbuttoned the front of his coat, revealing the massive bone-handled hunting knife and the heavy Walker Colt revolver tucked into his belt. He looked directly at Beaumont, then at the Pinkerton men, and finally settled his icy gaze on Sheriff Clary. "That gold buys the boy," Judd said softly. "Anybody tries to stop me from walking out of this town with him, I won't just kill them. I'll burn this entire street to the ground and dance in the ashes. Now, who wants to earn their wages today?" The Pinkertons exchanged nervous glances. They were paid to intimidate striking miners, not to tangle with a grizzly bear in human clothing who clearly had nothing to lose. Sheriff Clary swallowed hard, his hand slowly falling away from his gun. "Take the gold, Bogus," Clary muttered to the Reverend. "Let the wild man have him. It ain't worth the bloodshed." Beaumont scoffed, grabbing his daughter's hand. "This town is a barbaric cesspool. Come, Abigail, we will buy you a proper pony." He glared at Judd. "You will regret crossing me, mountain man." Judd didn't care about Beaumont's empty threats. He turned his back on the wealthiest man in the territory, knelt on the rough wooden boards of the auction block, and held out his massive scarred hand to the little boy. "Come on, Toby," Judd said gently. "We're going home." Toby looked at the outstretched hand. He looked at the heavy pistol on Judd's hip and then up into the man's eyes. Something in those deep blue eyes must have spoken to the boy, a silent promise of absolute safety. Toby reached out, his tiny dirt-caked fingers wrapping around Judd's thick thumb. Judd lifted the boy into his arms. Toby weighed practically nothing, a fragile bundle of sharp bones and ragged cloth. Judd wrapped his heavy buffalo coat around the boy, shielding him from the cold wind and the prying eyes of the town, and walked back to his horse. The ride up into the Mosquito Range was brutally cold. The sky turned the color of bruised iron, and large, wet flakes of snow began to fall, clinging to the pine needles and blanketing the treacherous mountain trail. Judd rode Duke at a steady, cautious pace, holding Toby securely against his chest beneath the heavy leather and fur of his coat. Toby didn't speak for the entire 4-hour journey. He was exhausted, shivering initially, but soon the immense body heat of the mountain man lulled the traumatized boy into a deep, exhausted sleep. Judd rode in silence, his mind a hurricane of violent memories, impossible hopes, and burning rage. If Toby was 5 years old, the timeline was undeniable. Josie had been pregnant when the cabin burned. She hadn't perished in the fire. The bones he had buried must have belonged to someone else, an attacker, or perhaps a poor soul used to fake her death. She had been taken, stolen. And for 5 years, she had raised their son in whatever hell she had been dragged into until they were finally separated. They reached Judd's secluded cabin just as dusk fell, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of deep indigo. The cabin was sturdy, built from massive logs and tucked beneath an overhang of granite that protected it from avalanches and the worst of the winter winds. Judd dismounted, carrying the sleeping boy inside. He quickly struck a match, lighting a kerosene lantern that bathed the single-room cabin in a warm golden glow. He laid Toby down on his own bed, a thick mattress of pine boughs covered in soft wolf and bear pelts. He worked quickly, building a roaring fire in the stone hearth. He hung a cast-iron pot of venison stew over the flames, the rich scent of meat and wild onions soon filling the small space. Toby stirred, coughing softly. He sat up, his green eyes wide with panic as he took in the strange surroundings, the drying racks of jerky, the traps hanging from the walls, the glinting steel of Judd's Winchester rifle leaning in the corner. "Easy now," Judd said softly, pouring a tin cup of fresh water from a bucket. He walked over slowly, crouching down so his massive frame wouldn't tower over the boy. "You're safe here. Nobody is ever going to put you on a block again. Drink this." Toby took the cup with trembling hands and drank greedily. When he finished, he looked at Judd. "Are you going to make me dig?" The question hit Judd like a physical blow. "Dig? The other men made me dig," Toby said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion a child should have. "In the dark, where the rocks are sharp." Judd felt a murderous heat rising in his chest, but he forced his face to remain perfectly calm. He reached over to the hearth and ladled a generous bowl of stew, handing it to the boy with a wooden spoon. "Eat first. We'll talk after." Toby ate like a starved wolf. Judd sat in a hand-carved rocking chair, watching the boy. He could see himself in the slope of Toby's shoulders, the shape of his jaw, but the eyes, the nose, the dark hair, that was all Josie. It was a miracle sitting right there on a wolf pelt, eating venison stew. When Toby finally set the empty wooden bowl down, Judd leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Toby," Judd said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to suppress, "I need to ask you about that locket." Toby immediately brought his hand up to his chest, defensively covering the silver piece through his ragged shirt. "I'm not going to take it from you," Judd assured him, raising his hands, showing his empty palms. I want to see the inside. Do you know how to open it?" Toby hesitated, then slowly pulled the leather cord over his head. He held the locket in his small hands. His fingernails were broken and caked with dark earth. He pressed the small hidden latch on the side, and the silver shell popped open. He handed it across the space between them. Judd took it with a hand that was steady when holding a rifle against a charging grizzly, but now shook like a leaf in the wind. He looked down at the open locket in the lantern light. On the left side, the silver was scratched and worn. On the right side, protected by a thin sliver of glass, was the tintype portrait. It was Judd, younger, his beard shorter, his eyes full of life and a future he thought he was going to have. A single tear broke loose from Judd's eye, tracking through the dirt and soot on his weathered cheek, disappearing into his thick beard. "Mama said he was a giant," Toby whispered, watching Judd intently. "She said he lived in the sky, up where the snow never melts. She said if I ever got lost, the man in the picture would come down from the mountain and find me." Judd closed his eyes, letting out a ragged, shaking breath. He looked at Toby, the boy's green eyes reflecting the firelight. "She was right," Judd said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I found you. I'm your father, Toby." Toby didn't look surprised. He just looked at the massive man, then down at his own dirty feet. "Are you gonna go find Mama now?" Judd snapped the locket shut, the sharp click echoing loudly in the quiet cabin. The grief that had paralyzed him for 5 years was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculated, and terrifying clarity. He stood up, towering in the small room. "Where did they take her, Toby?" Judd asked. "Who were the men with the star badges?" "They called the place the Devil's Cradle," Toby said, his voice trembling slightly at the memory. "In the deep rocks. They said Mama belonged to the company now, because of a debt. They took me away when I couldn't carry the heavy rocks anymore. Devil's Cradle. Judd knew of it. It wasn't a town. It was an illegal, off-the-books silver strike deep in the treacherous canyons of the San Juans, run by a syndicate of corrupt marshals and mining barons who used forced labor, convicts, kidnapped immigrants, and anyone they could frame for a debt to extract the ore in lethal conditions. Judd walked over to his heavy oak trunk sitting at the foot of his bed. He threw open the lid. He bypassed the winter blankets and reached into the false bottom. He pulled out 2 polished Colt revolvers, a bandolier heavy with .44 caliber brass and a sharpened hunting tomahawk. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a father. And God help any man who stood between him and the woman he loved. "Get some sleep, son," Judd said, racking the lever of his Winchester rifle, the mechanical clack sounding like a judge's gavel sealing a death warrant. "When the sun comes up, I'm going hunting." Dawn broke over the Mosquito Range like a bruised peach, casting a sickly pale light across the snow-capped peaks. Judd Lawson was already awake, saddling Duke in the bitter cold. He had spent the night watching Toby sleep, listening to the boy's ragged breathing, and tempering the white-hot rage in his soul into a cold, forged steel. He couldn't take a 5-year-old boy into a war zone. The journey to the Devil's Cradle in the San Juan Mountains would be punishing, and the destination was a slaughterhouse. Judd bundled Toby in heavy furs and rode him 3 miles across the ridge to the homestead of Clementine Ford. Clementine was a widow who had survived 2 harsh winters alone after her husband was taken by a silver mine cave-in. She was as tough as hickory wood, possessed a startlingly accurate aim with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun, and owed Judd her life after he had killed a starving cougar stalking her livestock 3 years prior. When Judd knocked on her door, the heavy yoke swung open to reveal Clementine, shotgun already leveled at his chest. Recognizing the mountain man, she lowered the barrels, her eyes shifting to the trembling bundle in his arms. "This is my son, Clem," Judd said, his voice flat, allowing no room for questions. "His name is Toby. I have to go into the deep rocks to fetch his mother." Clementine didn't ask how a man who had claimed to be a widower for half a decade suddenly had a 5-year-old child. She looked at the boy's scarred face, then at the heavy armament strapped to Judd's immense frame. She understood the language of frontier survival. "He'll be safe here, Judd," Clementine said, taking the boy gently but firmly. "Nobody comes up this draw. If they do, they leave in a pine box." Judd knelt, looking Toby in the eye. "I'm coming back, and I'm bringing her with me. You mind Miss Clementine?" Toby nodded slowly, his small hand clutching the silver locket beneath his shirt. "Shoot straight, Pa." The word "paw" hit Judd like a physical blow, but he merely nodded, turned on his heel, and mounted his horse. The ride southwest toward the San Juan Mountains was a grueling test of endurance. For 4 days, Judd pushed Duke through blinding snow squalls, frozen river crossings, and narrow switchbacks where one misstep meant a 1,000-foot drop into jagged granite canyons. Judd barely slept, surviving on dry jerky black coffee and a singular consuming purpose. By the 5th evening, the air began to change. The clean, biting scent of high-altitude pine gave way to the foul odor of sulfur, human waste, and coal smoke. He had reached the edge of the Uncompahgre Gorge. Judd dismounted, leaving Duke tied in a concealed thicket of spruce. He crept to the edge of the canyon rim on his belly, peering over the sheer rock face. Below him lay the Devil's Cradle. It was a nightmare carved into the earth. High rock walls formed a natural prison, sealing in a sprawling, muddy shanty town of canvas tents, wooden processing mills, and gaping black holes blown into the side of the mountain. Hundreds of ragged figures moved like ants in the muck, hauling carts of raw ore under the cracking whips of armed overseers. Watchtowers stood at the canyon's choke points, manned by guards with Gatling guns and repeating rifles. It was an impregnable fortress of misery. Judd pulled his spyglass from his coat and surveyed the perimeter. The operation was too massive, too well funded to be the work of mere rogue marshals. He watched as a lavish, enclosed carriage, completely out of place in the mud, was escorted into the camp by a dozen men wearing familiar brass badges. Out of the carriage stepped Cornelius Beaumont. Judd's grip on the brass spyglass tightened so fiercely his knuckles turned white. The pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. Beaumont didn't just want Toby at the auction as a plaything for his spoiled daughter. Beaumont's syndicate ran this entire slave camp. The boy had been deemed too small, too weak to mine the heavy silver ore, so the camp's wardens had quietly shipped him up to Leadville to be auctioned off by Reverend Bogus, another cog in Beaumont's corrupt machine, to recoup a few extra dollars. If Judd hadn't stopped in Leadville that day, Toby would have ended up in Beaumont's stable, dying of exposure while his mother rotted in Beaumont's secret mine. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, plunging the canyon into deep shadows illuminated only by the harsh orange glow of smelting fires. Judd didn't wait for total darkness. He moved like a shadow detached from the rocks. He descended a treacherous, near-vertical goat path that the guards deemed too dangerous to watch. He slipped his heavy Walker Colts back into their holsters and drew his bone-handled hunting knife. Gunfire would bring an army, silence would buy him time. He reached the canyon floor near the western watchtower. A guard in a thick wool coat was leaning against a support beam, rolling a cigarette. He never got the chance to strike a match. Judd materialized from the darkness, a hand clamping over the man's mouth while the blade found the space between his ribs with surgical practiced violence. The guard slumped silently into the mud. Judd took the guard's long canvas duster and pulled it over his buckskins, hiding his massive, recognizable frame in the dim light. He pulled his hat low and walked straight into the heart of hell. The noise inside the Devil's Cradle was deafening. The roar of the steam-powered ore crushers, the clanking of iron chains, and the agonizing coughs of men, dying of miners' consumption, masked Judd's heavy footsteps. He moved through the camp with calculated purpose, his eyes sweeping the faces of the damned. He bypassed the deep shafts where the men were sent, knowing that female captives were typically kept above ground to sort the crushed rock, cook, or launder the filthy garments of the guards. He found the sorting pens near the smelting furnaces. The heat here was blistering, the air thick with toxic dust. A line of 30 women, dressed in rags, were hunched over long wooden sluice boxes, sifting through sharp rocks with bleeding bare hands. Judd moved closer, pretending to inspect a structural timber. His eyes darted from face to face. Despair, sickness, hollow eyes. Then he saw her. She was at the far end of the trough. Her raven black hair was streaked with premature silver, chopped brutally short. Her shoulders were painfully thin beneath a sackcloth dress, and her hands were wrapped in bloody rags. But the profile, the elegant slope of her nose, the fierce, unbroken set of her jaw, was undeniably Josephine Mercer. Judd's breath caught. He took a step forward, the world narrowing down to a tunnel that ended at her. "Keep moving that rock, you worthless sow!" A heavy leather bullwhip cracked against the wooden trough, showering Josie in sharp gravel. Standing behind her was Marshal Hiram Cole, a notoriously vicious lawman who had supposedly died in a shootout 3 years ago. He had clearly faked his death to serve as Beaumont's head warden. Cole was a large, ugly man with a face scarred by smallpox and a cruel, jagged smile. Josie flinched but didn't cry out. She simply wiped the dust from her eyes and reached for another rock. "Deaf, are we?" Cole sneered, stepping up behind her and grabbing a handful of her chopped hair. He yanked her head back viciously. "Mr. Beaumont wants double quota tonight. Maybe I should send you down into the deep shafts with the men. Let's see how long you last in the dark without your little brat to cry over." Josie spat directly into Cole's eye. "Go to hell, Hiram!" Cole roared in fury, raising the heavy lead-tipped handle of the whip to strike her across the face. The blow never landed. Judd crossed the 20 yards of mud in 3 massive strides. He didn't bother drawing a weapon. He hit Marshal Cole with the sheer, unstoppably violent momentum of a runaway freight train. The impact lifted the corrupt lawman off his feet, sending him crashing backward through a wooden tool shed. Timber splintered with a deafening crack. The sorting pen erupted into chaos. The women screamed, scrambling away. 2 nearby guards spun around, raising their rifles. Judd didn't hesitate. He drew both Walker Colts in a blur of motion. Bang, bang. The twin cannons roared, the heavy .44 caliber slugs taking both guards off their feet before they could even aim. Josie had fallen into the mud. She scrambled backward, her eyes wide with terror as she looked up at the giant in the canvas duster. Judd kicked the duster aside, letting it fall into the muck, revealing his heavy buffalo coat and his face. Josie froze. The color drained completely from her dirt-streaked face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at the ghost standing in front of her, the man she had mourned in the dark every single night for 5 agonizing years. "Judd," she whispered, her voice cracking, breaking through the roar of the furnaces. "I'm here, Josie," Judd said, his voice thick, tears instantly mixing with the soot on his cheeks. "I found him. Toby is safe. I'm taking you home." Before she could move, a pile of splintered wood erupted behind Judd. Marshal Cole, bleeding profusely from a shattered nose, rose from the wreckage with a double-barreled Derringer in his hand. "Watch out!" Josie screamed. Cole fired. At this point-blank range, the small gun was lethal. Judd twisted instinctively, but the bullet tore through the thick buffalo hide and buried itself deep into his left shoulder. The impact staggered the giant mountain man, dropping him to one knee. "Lawson!" Cole spat blood, drawing a large Bowie knife with his free hand, realizing his guns were empty. "Should have stayed in the high country, you dumb animal!" Cole lunged, aiming the heavy blade directly at Judd's throat. Pain exploded in Judd's shoulder, radiating down to his fingertips. His left arm was useless, but he didn't need it. With a roar that echoed over the canyon walls, Judd caught Cole's knife wrist with his right hand. The sheer terrifying grip of the mountain man snapped the marshal's wrist like a dry twig. Cole shrieked in agony, dropping the blade. Judd didn't let go. He pulled the man forward, drew his heavy tomahawk from his belt, and drove the flat, blunt steel head directly into Cole's temple. The marshal collapsed into the mud, lifeless. Sirens began to wail across the canyon. The gunshots had alerted the central compound. Shouts echoed from the watchtowers, and the heavy thud of boots indicated dozens of armed guards rushing toward the sorting pens. Judd gritted his teeth, the pain in his shoulder burning like a hot coal. He holstered his weapons and reached out his massive right hand to Josie. She took it. As he pulled her to her feet, she threw her arms around his thick neck, burying her face in his chest. For one fleeting second, amidst the gunfire and the sirens, they were back by the Animas River, holding each other under the open sky. "He's really safe," Josie sobbed against his coat, her hands clutching him as if he were a mirage that might vanish. "He's safe. He has your eyes," Judd said softly, kissing the crown of her chopped hair. A bullet slammed into the sluice box next to them, showering them in splinters. Judd pulled her behind the heavy stone furnace for cover. He unslung his Winchester rifle with his good arm, wedging the stock against his hip. He looked down at Josie, his icy blue eyes hardened into diamonds. "Can you ride?" he asked. Josie looked at the approaching mob of guards, then up at her husband. A fierce, wild light ignited in her green eyes, the same light that had kept her alive in hell for 5 years. She bent down, picked up Marshall Cole's discarded Bowie knife, and gripped it tightly. "I can fight," she said. Judd smiled, a grim, terrifying expression. "Then let's go introduce Mr. Beaumont to the ghosts of the San Juans." The air in the canyon was thick with the acrid stench of black powder and burning canvas. Judd Lawson pressed his back against the rough, heated stones of the smelting furnace, his breathing heavy and ragged. Blood seeped through the thick buffalo hide of his coat, the derringer wound in his left shoulder, burning like a branding iron. But the adrenaline surging through his veins masked the worst of the shock. He had Josie. Against all the odds of this brutal frontier, she was breathing, fighting, and standing right beside him. From the central compound, a dozen Pinkerton guards swarmed toward the sorting pens, their repeating rifles barking in the dim light. Bullets chipped the stone above Judd's head, showering them with razor-sharp fragments. "How many?" Josie shouted over the deafening roar of the gunfire, her grip white-knuckled on the stolen Bowie knife. She was trembling not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming rush of hope. "Too many for a fair fight," Judd grunted. He wedged the stock of his Winchester Model 1873 against his hip. With his left arm virtually useless, he awkwardly clamped the barrel between his knees, violently racked the lever to chamber around, and swung out from cover. He fired blindly into the approaching mob. A guard in a bowler hat spun and collapsed in the mud. Judd racked the lever again, firing twice more, suppressing the advance just enough to buy them a few seconds of breathing room. "We can't go back up the goat path," Judd yelled over his shoulder, sliding back into cover. "They'll pick us off the canyon wall before we make it 20 yards. We need a distraction, something big." Josie's green eyes darted frantically around the chaotic camp. 5 years of enslavement had taught her every inch of the devil's cradle. She knew the schedules, the guard rotations, and most importantly, where the syndicate stored their supplies. "The powder house." Josie pointed a trembling, blooded finger toward a reinforced wooden shack built directly beneath the primary watchtower about 50 yards away. "They took a massive shipment of DuPont dynamite yesterday for the deep shafts. If we blow it, the tower comes down and it'll block the main access road." Judd looked at the shack, then at the open expanse of mud separating them from it. It was a suicide run, but dying on their feet was a damn sight better than whatever Cornelius Beaumont had planned for them. "Stay behind me," Judd ordered. He drew his remaining Walker Colt, the heavy pistol resting heavy in his right hand. "When I say go, you run for that shack. Do not stop. Do not look back." Suddenly, a mechanical, rhythmic grinding echoed over the canyon walls, followed by a terrifying, continuous roar. Brrr, rat-tat-tat-tat. A storm of lead tore through the wooden sluice boxes, annihilating the heavy timbers and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Dust and rock exploded all around them. Judd threw his massive frame over Josie, shielding her from the devastation. High up on the canyon ridge, overlooking the camp, Cornelius Beaumont stood safely behind a mounted Gatling gun. His men furiously cranked the heavy iron weapon, raining indiscriminate death upon the sorting pens. Beaumont didn't care who he hit, guards, slaves, or the mountain man. He only cared about protecting his empire. "He's slaughtering his own men," Josie screamed, covering her ears as a Pinkerton guard caught in the crossfire was shredded by the Gatling gun's unrelenting barrage. "He doesn't care," Judd roared back. "Go, now!" Judd stepped out into the open, ignoring the hail of bullets tearing up the mud around his boots. He raised his Winchester, took careful aim at the Gatling gun's muzzle flash high on the ridge, and fired. He didn't hit the gunner, but the heavy 44-40 bullet sparked violently against the weapon's brass casing, causing the crew to flinch and momentarily halt their cranking. It was the only window they would get. Josie sprinted. She was barefoot, emaciated and exhausted, but the thought of seeing Toby's face gave her the speed of a frightened doe. She splashed through the freezing mud, dodging the bodies of fallen guards and overturned ore carts. Judd followed, providing cover and fire. He moved with a heavy, terrifying grace, an unstoppable force of nature, pushing through the mechanical slaughter of the industrial age. A guard stepped out from behind a tent, raising a shotgun. Judd didn't even break stride. He fired the Walker Colt from the hip, the deafening boom echoing like thunder as the guard was thrown backward. Josie reached the powder house. The heavy iron padlock on the door was locked tight. She smashed the hilt of the Bowie knife against it, but it barely dented the metal. Judd slammed into the wall beside her, breathing heavily, his face pale from blood loss. He looked at the lock, holstered his pistol, and swung his heavy steel tomahawk with every ounce of strength remaining in his good arm. The blade sheared through the iron hasp with a shower of sparks. Josie kicked the door open. The shack was stacked to the ceiling with wooden crates marked danger, explosives, coils of fuse wire hung from the walls. "Fuse is too slow," Judd yelled, glancing back as the Pinkertons began to regroup and advance through the mud. The Gatling gun on the ridge started its mechanical grinding again. "I'll shoot the caps. Get clear. Make for the rock wall." "I am not leaving you again, Judd Lawson," Josie screamed, grabbing his thick buffalo coat. "You have to, for Toby." Before they could argue, the ground beneath them began to rumble. The deafening sound of the Gatling gun was suddenly drowned out by a primal, earth-shattering roar from the depths of the canyon. The slaves had revolted. The gunshots and the chaos had been the spark the damned souls of the Devil's Cradle needed. Hundreds of desperate men, Irish immigrants, Chinese rail workers, and framed miners surged from the deep shafts and the processing mills. They were armed with pickaxes, heavy iron chains, and drilling hammers. A tide of starving, furious humanity crashed into the Pinkerton guards. The camp devolved into absolute anarchy. The guards were overwhelmed in seconds, dragged down into the mud by sheer numbers. "Now," Judd yelled. He shoved Josie behind a heavy iron ore cart outside the shack. He raised his Winchester, aiming straight into the center of the dynamite crates. He didn't blink. He pulled the trigger. The explosion was apocalyptic. A blinding flash of white light turned the night into high noon, followed immediately by a concussive shock wave that physically lifted Judd and Josie off the ground, throwing them backward into the mud. The powder house vaporized. The blast tore upward, ripping the foundations out from under the massive wooden watchtower. With a groaning, agonizing shriek of tearing timber, the 70-foot tower collapsed inward, thousands of tons of wood and stone crashing down across the main access road, completely sealing off the canyon entrance. The Devil's Cradle was shut tight. Judd's ears were ringing so loudly he couldn't hear the fires roaring around him. He tasted copper and ash. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his left arm completely numb, his vision swimming. "Josie," he gasped, frantically searching the smoke-filled darkness. "I'm here," a soft, trembling voice answered. Josie crawled through the mud, her face blackened with soot, but miraculously in one piece. She wrapped her arm around Judd's waist, hauling the massive mountain man to his feet. "We have to climb. Now, before the smoke clears." They stumbled away from the burning wreckage, moving toward the steep, jagged rock face of the canyon wall where Judd had descended. The slave revolt was in full swing. The canyon floor was a war zone of fire and vengeance. As they reached the base of the goat path, a figure emerged from the thick, oily smoke, coughing violently and clutching a silver-plated revolver. It was Cornelius Beaumont. The railroad tycoon's tailored suit was torn and covered in mud. His bowler hat was gone, revealing a bald, sweat-slicked head. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, cut off from his carriage and his surviving guards by the collapsed tower. Beaumont locked eyes with Judd and raised his revolver, his hand shaking violently. "You!" Beaumont shrieked, his aristocratic voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "You ruined everything! Millions of dollars in silver! My empire!" Judd pushed Josie behind him, standing tall despite the blood pouring from his shoulder. He stared down the barrel of Beaumont's gun with eyes as cold as a glacial lake. "You built an empire on the blood of stolen men and women," Judd rumbled, his voice cutting through the crackling fires. "You tried to buy my son like a piece of livestock. I can pay you," Beaumont yelled, taking a step back, suddenly realizing the absolute terrifying stillness of the man standing before him. "Name your price. $10,000? 20. Just get me out of this canyon safely, and you can have the woman, the boy, anything you want." Judd didn't reach for his gun. He simply took a slow, deliberate step forward. "There ain't enough gold in the earth to buy a man's soul, Beaumont," Judd said softly, "and the mountain doesn't take bribes." Beaumont let out a terrified cry and pulled the trigger of his revolver. Click. The fine silver-plated mechanism, unaccustomed to the grit and mud of the canyon, jammed. Beaumont stared at the gun in horror, frantically pulling the trigger again and again. Click, click, click. Judd didn't have to strike him. From the smoke behind Beaumont, a shadow emerged. It was a massive Irish miner, his chest bare and scarred from the whips, carrying a heavy steel-headed sledgehammer. Beaumont turned just in time to see the hammer swing. He didn't even have time to scream. Judd turned away before the body hit the mud. He grabbed Josie's hand, and together they began the agonizing ascent up the canyon wall. The climb was a brutal test of endurance. Every step sent flares of agony through Judd's wounded shoulder. He slipped twice on the treacherous, icy rocks, his massive frame nearly pulling them both into the abyss, but Josie's grip on him was ironclad. She anchored him, whispering fiercely in his ear, promising him that they were almost there, promising him that Toby was waiting. It took them 3 hours to breach the canyon rim. When they finally pulled themselves over the ledge, collapsing into the freezing, pristine snow of the high country. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the Mosquito Range in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Below them, the Devil's Cradle was a burning tomb, the flames consuming the greed and cruelty of men who thought they could own the world. Judd lay on his back in the snow, staring up at the clear, infinite sky. He felt a soft hand brush the matted hair from his forehead. Josie was looking down at him, tears streaming silently down her soot-stained cheeks, illuminated by the dawn. "We did it," she whispered. Judd reached up with his good right hand, pulling her down to his chest. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of her, feeling the steady, miraculous beat of her heart against his own. For the first time in 5 years, the ghost of the mountains wept. They found Duke exactly where Judd had tied him. The massive buckskin horse whinnied softly at the smell of blood, but held steady as Josie helped Judd into the saddle, climbing up behind him and wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. The ride back to Clementine Ford's cabin was slow, deliberate, and quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the world completely silent and blanketed in pure white snow. It was mid-afternoon when the small log cabin finally came into view. Smoke was curling lazily from the stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the frozen wilderness. Before Judd could even bring Duke to a full halt in the yard, the heavy oak door burst open. Toby ran out onto the porch, wearing an oversized wool sweater Clementine had found for him. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the massive horse, at his wounded father, and at the woman sliding down from the saddle. Josie's knees buckled the moment her feet hit the snow. She fell forward, her arms outstretched. "Toby!" she cried out, a sound of such profound, shattering joy that it echoed through the pines. "Mama!" Toby ran through the snow as fast as his little legs could carry him, launching himself into his mother's arms. Josie wrapped him up, burying her face in his neck, rocking him back and forth in the snow, sobbing uncontrollably. Toby was crying too, his tiny hands desperately clutching the back of her ruined dress, making sure she was real. Judd slid down from Duke, leaning heavily against the saddle. He watched them, a fierce protective warmth blooming in his chest, melting away the last remnants of the cold that had trapped him for half a decade. Toby pulled back slightly, his tear-streaked face looking at his mother. With shaking fingers, he pulled the heavy leather cord from beneath his shirt, revealing the silver locket. He pressed the latch, popping it open to show her the picture of the giant in the sky. "He came, Mama," Toby sniffled, wiping his nose. "Just like you said, Pa came down from the mountain." Josie looked up at Judd. Her eyes were bright, shining with a love that had survived fire, slavery, and time itself. She stood up, holding Toby against her hip, and walked over to Judd. She placed her hand gently over his wounded shoulder, rising on her tiptoes to press her lips to his. Clementine Ford stood on the porch, a double-barreled shotgun resting casually over her shoulder, a knowing, satisfied smile on her weathered face. A week later, Judd, Josie, and Toby rode north. They left Colorado, leaving behind the silver strikes, the corrupt marshals, and the graves of men who had tried to play God. They headed into the deep, untouched wilderness of the Wyoming Territory, to a valley where the pines grew tall and the rivers ran clear. They built a new cabin, stronger than the last, knowing that whatever storms came, they would face them together. The mountain man wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a father, a husband, and a protector of a love that could not be broken. If you were captivated by this thrilling tale of survival, mountain justice, and a father's relentless love, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most gripping, heart-pounding stories from the wild frontier every single week. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an adventure, and share this video with your friends who love historical drama and epic romance. What did you think of Judd's ultimate sacrifice? Leave a comment below. Your support helps us keep the campfire burning. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.